So now we have our third meditation, and we kind of circle back to the middle, which is going to be personal problems. And the third canticle that we're going to deal with is the Magnificat. And remember, the Nunc was kind of this direction, and the Benedictus was kind of this direction, and the Mag is down here. Sort of relation, you can say it's like this, or you can say it's like this. It's probably better to say it's like this. It's about my soul being magnified by God. And all of the canticles really are canticles of the Incarnation, but especially the Magnificat, because it's this song of the Mother of God after she becomes pregnant with God himself in her womb. And all the canticles are incarnational, and that's why it's during the Gospel Canticles at the daily office that we sense the altar. So the daily offices are different from sacraments. All the sacraments are extensions of the Incarnation into the present, because there is a physical element to them. The Incarnation is all about God becoming flesh. And sacraments, one of the things that is distinctive about the sacraments is that it's not just up here. It's something that is incarnated. And so that's why at Evensong we sense the altar at the Magnificat, because it's a hymn of the Incarnation, and Jesus becomes, in a sense, sacramentally present with us in the Eucharist. So we'll pick back up at one of the things we talked about last time and actually caused a little bit of consternation or discussion, is about picking up my side of the street. So, when we have our direction coming like that, it's about seeing myself in relation to God. So, what is my life like? How am I responding to God coming in, bursting into my life and being present? Am I keeping my side of the street? Is it affecting the way that I'm living my life? And so what has God done in my life? And how is he still working in my life? And I talked earlier about, at the beginning of the day, I do all the intercessions. And towards the close of the day, at evening prayer, it's how come I do the confession, both the confession and the thanksgiving. So it's kind of like having a list of like the good and the bad. Like, what can I look back over this day, and what can I say didn't measure up that I did, and also how has God been present in my life? What are the positives? And well, we just went to a bookstore, and actually, when I was younger, my family owned a bookstore, and Books A Million helped put us out of business. So it's like I sort of held my tongue when you said you want to go to Books A Million. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But once a year, we would have store-wide inventory. And the thing about inventory is you would go through. Oh, you've done this before, obviously.
5 times. It's
okay.
Interesting.
But you would have basically 2 objectives. You would see what's been selling, which you need to focus on, and what's not selling, what's not working, which you need to send back to the publisher. So it's about both taking the inventory of the good and the bad, the positive and the negative. And there's a practice of making moral inventory every so often. And sometimes it's easy just to be focused on all the bad. Or it's like, if we're preparing to make a sacramental confession, obviously then we're going to see, well, where have I failed? What do I need to turn back to God on? What do I need to surrender up to him? But it's also important to see what's positive as well. Where have I been responding to God? Because the whole point of it is not just to stay somewhere, but is to keep on moving, to keep on moving closer and closer and closer to Christ, becoming more and more like him. And there are a couple of interactions with Jesus that I want to use as examples. One of them we just read, Zacchaeus, but I want to start with one from the chapter before in St. Luke, which is the rich young ruler. So this is a young man who comes, and he is highly esteemed by his fellow Jews because he's obviously rich and successful and wise and well educated. And he asks Jesus about what does he need to do in order to have eternal life. And Jesus reiterates basically the commandments. And he says, all these I've kept from my youth up. So actually, there is some positive there. He has responded to the grace that God's given him, to the revelation in the Old Covenant. And so he's not an utter failure. He is actually pretty good. But Jesus looks on him. St. Luke doesn't include that detail, but one of the other evangelists says he looked on him, and he loved him. So he gave him a hard truth. He gave him a tough love. And it's not because he disdained him or dismissed him, but because he loved him. He told him what he really needed to know. And he said, well, if you're going to have eternal life, go and sell all you have and give to the poor and come and follow me. And there's a famous saint, St. Anthony of Egypt, who came into church right when that part was being read. And he went and he sold all that he had, and he went out in the desert in Egypt. He was one of the first monks, somebody who had completely surrendered everything in order to follow Jesus. So he followed that advice very dramatically and very radically. But one thing to remember, this is going to sound like I'm trying to weasel out of that, which I'm not. This was Jesus's advice to this one particular guy. He has slightly different advice for each one of us. So he knew that the stumbling block in this guy's life was his love of riches and his esteem of riches. So he says you need to be able to surrender that and remove that in order to follow me, so that you don't have that you're clinging to in this world. So he knew that he had this earthly attachment that was keeping himself from giving himself completely to the kingdom. Because remember, you can't take it with you. Any attachment we have here in this world, ultimately, we're going to have to surrender. And this young man has defined himself by all that stuff, all his riches and all the worldly esteem. And Jesus says, I've got something better for you. I've got myself to give to you. I'm even better than all the riches in the world. And the sad thing about it is that he doesn't take it. He doesn't follow. He doesn't accept that gift. And it says that he goes away sad because he had many riches. But he would still rather be left with the comfort of this world, of all his familiar problems, than to surrender them all and to follow Jesus. Now, in the next chapter, what we just read, even in prayer, we have the story of Zacchaeus. And so he's kind of, in a sense, an inverse of the rich young man. He is rich himself, obviously, but he is hated by his fellow Jews. He's seen as a turncoat. We talked about that earlier. And he, when I was little, I loved that story because you could relate to having to get up in the tree to see Jesus. Because Zacchaeus is short. But he still is kind of a mixed bag because he still wants to control. He wants to get above Jesus in a sense. And one of the things that Jesus says to him is, come down, and I'm going to meet you when I bring you down. So even though he's of short stature, he has exalted himself mentally. He still thinks he's above everybody else. But this encounter with Jesus changes him. And so he is willing to, he says, everything that I've taken, I'm going to restore, and I'll give, did he say fourfold or two? Yeah, fourfold to the poor. So he actually, even though he's not specifically asked to, he fulfills that command that was given to the rich young ruler. And so, having exalted himself, he is willing to humble himself and to follow Jesus. And again, just like our previous talk, the key term in here is humility. So we need to have humility when we're dealing with each other, but we also need to have humility when we're dealing with ourselves, with our own relationship with Jesus. Because we have to see ourselves as God sees us, not just in relation to each other, or not in relation to what we have, or how we're esteemed in the world, but in relation to ourselves and in relation to God. And that's the solution to our personal problems. Now, it sounds really pat and easy. Oh, just get right with God and everything's going to work out. And in a sense, that is true. I mean, it is true. But when the rubber hits the road, there's a lot of work we have to do. And Jesus says to take up our cross daily and to follow him. It would be a lot easier if he said, just take up your cross one time and follow me. But he says, take up your cross daily. So each and every day, we talk about one moment or one day at a time, or one moment at a time. We could interpret that as always be carrying your cross and following me day in and day out. But the cross is what puts everything in perspective, because the cross is about God intersecting our life. We talked about the incarnation as God coming down into human history, and it finds its focus in the cross. The cross is the hinge of human history. So the cross, you can think of the horizontal beam as being like the timeline of human history, and the vertical beam is God coming down and intersecting that history. So the very symbol of our religion is that intersection of human history by God. And it's true of each one of us as well, our own life. You can think of, my life as this part, and then God intersects my life. And so he calls us all to have a cross-shaped life. So the vertical beam is our relation with God, our love for God. Remember what the two commands are: to love God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind. And then our neighbor is ourself. So the horizontal beam is our love of our neighbor. But the thing you have to notice is that the vertical beam is the one that's got to be grounded. So my relation with God is the thing that's got to be grounded and sure and fixed, so that I can have relations with y'all this way, spiritual connection here. Or else, if I just try to do this beam, it's going to fall on the ground. It can't levitate. So this beam rests upon this beam. And so our whole entire life becomes a symbol or an image of God himself, who came into human history, became one of us, and then died on the cross in order to unite this humanity to himself. And so I'll close with a couple more questions. And also the sheets that I gave you, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to work on it. If you get up early tomorrow morning, that might be a good time if you haven't had a chance to work on it yet. I'd probably try to at least sort of look over them and have some time to think about it before we go back home, because then once we get back home, it's going to go in the round filing cabinet probably, or you're going to forget about it. But the whole point actually of a retreat is to go away. Because when you're in an unfamiliar environment, that's when you're like watching for, like the enemy, or, you have to watch where you are. And that's why we go on retreat. I mean, we could be doing this at the center, but we are intentional, and again, I hate that word intentional, about going somewhere else and as it were, training ourselves in order to, see what's going on, so we can really see what's going on here. So the final questions are: how do you respond to the trite or simplistic advice about your personal problems when people are like, oh, just pray more, just pray about it? And again, that's true, but very often people would do that in a dismissive way. a few years ago, one of my favorite Babylon Bee articles was FDA approves Just Pray More as treatment for Christians with depression. And, and they also said that you could use Just Bring It to God, or Just Don't Be So Sad. Because we always want these easy little cookie cutter answers. And a lot of times our problems are more complicated than that. I mean, they're simple and they're complicated at the same time. So when you hear these trite or simplistic pieces of advice about your personal problems, can you find any truth in them, and can you sort of take what you need and leave the rest? And the last question is, how does a moral inventory fit into your spiritual life? One thing I do at the end of the day, I keep a little journal, and I sort of list, as it were, the pros and the cons, or the credits and the debits, and then other things I'm thankful for, and that makes it very simple when I'm ready to do a sacramental confession, because I can just go back and I can review and see where are the places that I failed, and what do I need to work on. So again, how do you respond to the very simplistic, chipper Christians who think they have an easy solution for all your spiritual problems? And then how do you use a moral inventory, or do you use a moral inventory in your own spiritual life?
I suppose with the first one, usually I guess just ignore it, I suppose. I'm just trying not to let it get to me too much, or even sometimes just kind of take it with a painted on smile, because sometimes it's just best not to try and start a fight over it.
I confess I don't run into these chipper Christians very often.
Well, you might be sharing something that's struggling, or this problem, a problem with you and you're struggling with, and they would just be like, "Well, have you prayed about it?" And sometimes I'm like, "Well, of course I prayed about it." I pray about it all the time, and I'm coming to you because I want some help in order to be able to see,
It's something that you can do, not
Yeah.
something I can do.
Yeah. And I think maybe it's because people are scared or they're intimidated, and they're worried that they're going to say the wrong thing. And so that's a really simple response. And there, of course, there's truth in that. You should be praying about it. And maybe I'm weird. I just assume anybody will have prayed about some problem that you're struggling with. But maybe that is what somebody needs to hear at the right time. Just pray about it.
Well, you kind of just said what I was gonna say.
What's that?
How do I word this respectfully? I need to work harder to love those people. We'll put it like that, because my thought process is, obviously, you should be praying about your problems, but when you're praying about your problems, you're telling God. If I'm talking to Hoff, you're not God. I'm asking you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think a better answer that people should do more often is, if they don't want to say, if they can't come up with a thing, would be, I'll pray for you. I thought that's a lot more sincere than asking if I've prayed about something.
And a lot of times, what we just want someone to listen and understand. And so, there's that video, It's Not About the Nail. Have you seen that one about the woman with the nails sticking out of her head, and she's telling her husband, how painful it is, and she snags her sweaters and everything, and he thinks she wants a solution, and what she wants is him just to say, that must be really tough.
Well, he tries to take the nail out.
I know, he tries to take the nail out, and it's an interesting, there are a lot of different ways you can look at that video. And I think in terms of this, and I think a lot of times, very often, people just want you to listen and they don't necessarily want you to solve the problem. Like to know that you understand where they're coming from can be very powerful. So you can say, you know, I can really relate to that. That's a little bit of a trite answer, but I have a story about this. Years ago, we had a rector. He's deceased now, but he, God rest his soul, he was just, everything was chaos and disorganization. And I got to where, at first, like I thought my job was to make up for all of his shortcomings. And then I learned that I was going to be burned out if I did that. If I made my ministry about taking up for his shortcomings. And I had to really set some barriers. And I had to stick to those barriers. And I had to say, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll do anything you want me to. I just need to know before I arrive on Sunday morning, for instance. Because I can't deal with the finding out, 4 minutes before Mass what's going to go on. And there's somebody in the church who was in charge of doing the hymn boards, putting the numbers on the hymn boards. And this one morning before church, he came to me and he was like, the hymns in the bulletin are different from the hymns that Father gave me. And I don't know what to do. And so the previous me would have just rescued the situation and say, okay, don't worry, I'll take care of it, and go run and figure it all out. But the me that had established boundaries, when he told me this problem, he must have thought I was totally crazy, because I said, I can really relate to that, because that had been my experience with that priest, getting all these mixed messages, and I didn't have to solve the problem. That was not my job. So for me, actually, that was a personal and an interpersonal problem, where I realized that I really needed to, like I said, establish some boundaries. Now, boundaries are better than walls, because boundaries are flexible, and you can see over the boundary, and you can still have communication over the boundary. So that's different from building a wall. But also a boundary can keep me safe, like if I need to have some protection from somebody else's craziness or their chaos. Because again, it's not my job to fix them. That's Jesus' job. I can give them up to Jesus. I can surrender them to Jesus and let Jesus be in control. But I'm not necessarily the one that has to fix them. But eventually what I found with this priest was, when I stuck to those boundaries, he figured it out. And he stopped sort of pushing the boundaries and testing it. And it was a whole lot easier to work with him when I had clearly defined boundaries. You have something else? Anybody else? Oh, uh-huh.
I was just going to say, I think the moral inventory is interesting, because I had previously heard it worded that way. Maybe it's not what it is.
What, in terms of the positive and the negative?
Or just in terms of the word moral inventory.
Yeah. So it's like you kind of look inside and you see, okay, what is everything that's there? So you're trying to be completely honest and brutally honest with yourself, because God sees it all. He sees it even better than I do. But it's a way for me to get more attuned with how God sees me and to get that humility. Anybody else? Okay, remember to mash the like button and the subscribe button.